The Traitors is a psychological game show where everybody makes horrendously bad decisions because that's psychology. That's group dynamics. We're going to discuss why everything is such a mess. I'm a therapist and I have a lot of thoughts about this. In fact, a particularly big point that it feels like nobody ever talks about, and I'm really keen to mention that, but we're going to start with the simpler point first. One of the obvious but consistently repeated mistakes you see happening a lot in this show, which says a lot about the ways we think as people. The Traitors is a game show in which 20 odd contestants enter a castle and 3 of them are secretly selected to play as the Traitors with the power every night to murder one of the other contestants, the Faithful, aka removing them from the show. It's the job of the Faithful to figure out who the Traitors are, and every evening all of them gather around a round table and vote for who they think is a traitor and who should be banished. Season 3 of the UK version is currently airing, 9 episodes have been released at the time of recording. Let's discuss things now. So, there will be some spoilers for some episodes, though obviously the season is still going at the moment, so no ultimate spoilers, and I'm only discussing specific instances that help paint the picture we need to paint. For example, take this situation. In episode 4, 3 players return who were forced to voluntarily exit the game at the very beginning of this show. Why they volunteered to exit would make an interesting video on its own, however there's now a chance for 2 of them to re-enter the game, depending on which of them the other players fight to save. Happy times, right? Well, no. The interesting bit here is that once 2 of them have been saved, the host Claudia announces that they could be entering the game either as traitors or faithfuls. Okay, that puts everyone a bit on edge. Is one of them a traitor? Well, no. Neither of them are traitors. In fact, it's pretty unlikely they would be. At one time, there can only ever be up to 3 traitors in the show. Based on their understanding of the game, they would likely assume 3 were picked at the beginning. One of them was banished in an earlier episode, so that makes it possible one of these 2 is entering to fill that gap. However, there was also a night before this where nobody was murdered, meaning there's a high chance the traitors tried to recruit somebody that night rather than murder, and if they did, there would already be 3 traitors at the point these 2 are entering the game, therefore neither of them are traitors. And as it happens, the traitors did attempt to recruit that night, and the recruit did say no, but nobody really knows that. All of that means the probability either of these 2 are traitors is very low. I don't know exactly what the probability is because I'm a therapist, not a mathematician, and it's also not the point I'm making. The point is, despite that low probability, people are very quick to start assuming one of them is probably a traitor. But why? Why would they think that? Both Alexander and Fozy get a lot of heat on them because of this. Heat that Alexander especially has still never quite shaken in the following 5 episodes. I think there's a lot of different cognitive biases we could mention here. One is confusing possibility with probability. It's possible one of them is a traitor, therefore that starts to feel likely. There's also the equiprobability bias, which is incorrectly thinking all possible outcomes are equally likely. For example, these 2 could either be traitors or faithful. Yes or no? If you think about it for a second, being faithful is much more likely, and yet it feels like a 50-50 choice. It feels like there's a 50-50% chance they could be traitors, and if you start to think that, then you logically think one of them probably is. One of them accounts for that 50%. And what then happens is you go down a rabbit hole. You kind of limit your scope to a particular group of people. This kind of thing happens a lot, like when Freddy concluded someone in this clique of friends is probably a traitor, therefore he starts only looking at them. In this example, the players are only looking at Fozia or Alexander rather than focusing as intensely on everyone. But they're all intelligent people. If they took a second to reflect on their thinking, they'd probably realise this is a mistake, and maybe they did realise that, because neither Fozia or Alexander at the time of recording have been banished. However, when you are in a stressful situation and there is such pressure, it's easy to forget these facts. As I've said before, uncertainty is an incredibly distressing thing. It's easy to find yourself wanting to simplify the problem. Rather than the more complex probability that proves it's unlikely either is a traitor, you simplify it down to 50-50, or you limit your scope to one group of people because simplicity feels like a life raft when you're burdened with so much uncertainty. The game feels more bearable if you simplify it, but that doesn't actually make it more accurate. But this kind of situation happens so much, I can give you 3 examples of it in this season alone. In episode 6, the Traitors pick 4 contestants to enter into a deathmatch in which one of them will be removed from the show. It is possible for the Traitors to pick themselves to enter this game, but why would you enter yourself when it gives you a 25% chance of being eliminated? Unless you're a traitor who's got serious heat on them and you really need to look innocent, it's an illogical and very risky thing to do. And yet, just as before, because it's possible for traitors to enter the deathmatch, people start assuming one of them is a traitor. No! None of them are. Stop it. Everyone who survives that deathmatch are left with giant question marks over their heads, even though it's much more likely they were put into that deathmatch because they're faithfuls and because the traitors want them gone. Here's another example that works in their favour though. 2 sisters are in this season, Amani and Maya, and people quickly assume that one of them must be a traitor because it feels like it makes sense. In fact, one of them is actually a traitor and they do get banished partly because of this line of thinking. There are definitely other factors involved. In fact, I want to mention 2 other factors that we can factor into these examples. I've said the word fact a lot there. The first factor, I suppose, we could generally refer to as projection. This is where we can finally touch on a bit of group dynamics. Because whilst these 2 contestants did meet everybody briefly at the start of the game, they've also missed out on a lot before they enter here. They've not been there when everyone else was forming bonds and getting to know each other. They're not part of the in-group. They're the others, the unknown variable, the unexpected surprise that chucks even more uncertainty into the pot, even more things to question. In that sense, it's easy to see how the faintest effects of a them and us mentality might occur here. Not to say it does for certain, but it's definitely possible. The in-group might be full of suspicion, but these are all also people they have gotten to know, have some idea about, formed relationships with. They are fundamentally part of the group, whereas these other 2 are referred to as the newbies. It would then be easy to feel guarded towards them, and this extra anxiety due to the uncertainty they bring could then make it easy to just feel naturally skeptical of them. You see, this is the theory. There's a psychoanalyst named Wilfred Bion, famous for his theories on group dynamics and for writing things in an annoyingly confusing way. Bion argued that the purpose of any group isn't just the task they are given. In this instance, the task being given is to catch traitors. That would be the overt task, or the work group task in Bion's language. However, there is also the covert and unconscious task, or the basic assumption. And that less conscious task is the general motivation to manage everybody's anxieties and tensions. You know, any group is a big melting pot of everyone's feelings and projections and all sorts of mess that people bring with them. And that stuff can be difficult to handle. You know, we've got enough mess of our own. Now we're having to juggle everyone else's in this group. Whether conscious or not, groups can quickly fall into methods and roles helped to manage all of that. All of this general mess, and that's often to the detriment of their actual task. I'm sure you've all experienced this at some point. When you're in groups and there's something you're all really supposed to do, but it seems like everyone is just getting sidetracked by other issues all of the time, and there's other conflicts. This is why the overt task is finding the traitors, but the covert task is making the group feel as manageable and bearable as you can. Therefore, you might start throwing suspicion and projection and shade on people that don't fit, let's say. In this example, Alexander and Fozia are relatively unknown and their appearance further complicates the game. That doesn't make them traitors, however the covert task of managing anxiety would suggest things are much simpler without them here. Let's consider banishing them, let's just make this all a bit more bearable for ourselves. But there's of course also differences in other ways. A lot of arguments have been made to suggest a tendency for neurodivergent players, or those who represent minorities, to get banished more often than others. And I think those arguments do have some backing, which isn't to say any of these contestants are racist when they target Kasim, or ableist when they don't understand Dan, who is autistic, is choosing to play the game in a very different way to them. I would hope though I can't know, that none of these people are at all like that. And that's why it's so interesting to spot how discrimination can still occur, and why people just saying, well, I'm not racist or whatever, therefore it's probably nothing, why that isn't enough. Because the best, or at least most obvious way for the group here to manage anxieties and reduce a lot of the tension is to make sure everyone there is on the same page. Everybody thinks like a hive mind, everybody is the same, because that's just easier, it's more relaxed. You'd feel like there's less tensions. However, one, tensions will still keep occurring. You can't just banish anxiety. The people you got rid of were probably fulfilling an important role within that group. And two, removing difference more than likely makes for a less efficient group that's much less good at the overt task. We need difference and conflict to an extent in order to function at our best, to have differing opinions and new ideas, and to stimulate more creativity. I imagine if all of them had the space to step back and really think about Dan, they would understand perfectly fine why he's playing the game differently and why that doesn't make him a traitor. However, in this stressful group situation, I think this kind of thinking can get stuck in their heads. It's why it's always important to try and be aware of the ways a group's overt task might be being sabotaged by the need to manage anxieties. It's actually for this reason that a lot of my training required me to attend various group relations conferences, which is basically a several day or week-long event where you all get put into groups, sometimes with various pointless tasks to do, but generally the overt task is basically just to learn more about the ways you behave in groups and how all of this unconscious stuff works. And those conferences can be incredibly grueling and really powerful and really great. When I said last video that people underestimate just how emotionally charged being on the Traitors would be, you know, why the hell do they form such strong bonds with strangers over a couple of days? Why do they break down in tears over things that are just a game? This is what can happen when you're put into groups for intense periods of time without the space for outside perspective. Everybody's internal worlds get mixed into the melting pot, and it is exactly as emotional as it looks there. I've experienced that myself. Factor 2, just quickly, this is a TV show. All of them know it's a show made for people's entertainment. Why does it feel like it makes sense for one of the sisters to be a traitor? Well, because that would be a good twist. That would be a compelling narrative, entertainment. I imagine that is probably why one of the sisters was made a traitor in the first place. The showmakers thought it would be interesting to see how that might affect the siblings. Why might one of these newbies be a traitor? Because it would be a good twist. The problem, of course, there is you can just say that for a lot of things. They do never explicitly say that. I wonder if they're not supposed to directly mention the fact about it being a show like that. But you can spot this kind of thinking easily leading people astray, such as Kasim. Jake accuses him of being a traitor basically because he's a doctor. It feels poetic to imagine he saves lives during the day and then murders at night. He says that just makes sense. No, it doesn't make sense, Jake. It definitely doesn't, but you can understand why this kind of thinking gets stuck in your head when you're all really stressed and uncertain all of the time. There is some level of logic in trying to consider what would make for good TV. Let's move on though. There's an entirely different point I want to discuss.
I am
entitled to 51% off World Anvil. Oh, you better believe it's World Anvil. They are sponsoring this video, they are offering you 51% off, and they are an online tool for building worlds, you may have guessed. But also creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for all sorts of different games. My best friend uses it for D&D, but there's lots of other games. You can use it for planning your stories, writing your stories, working on all sorts of creative projects. For me, it is my novel. I need a tool like this, otherwise I am far too chaotic. We're moving flat soon, and I literally have 6 cardboard boxes full of random sheets of A4 paper I've written old ideas on. Pre-World Anviled me was a nightmare. So with something like this, not only can I keep everything organised, keep it all in one place, be able to easily edit things, but I can create timelines, I can create hyperlinks branching off specific characters or articles or a billion other things that just make it so much easier to find stuff. Planning things can be hard, especially when there's so much to do, but having all of these tools to help visualize
visualize it, to help split everything down into specific points, articles one at a time. It helps immensely. I'm not going to show you because it's a secret, but I've created different bio pages for all of the characters in my world, even the minor ones, which house they live in, what their job is, who they're friends with, who they hate, what different beliefs they have or opinions about events that go on in a book, or whatever. So, World Anvil is great. I hope you can hear my passion, and if you desire, if you crave. If you call to the heavens for a 51% discount, then use the code TREE, or click the link in the description, or the pinned comment, or if you just want to try out the free version, then go for that. You know, there's no time limit on it. Test it out for as long as you want. World Anvil.
Okay, firstly, can I touch on Kasim a little bit more? There's 3 main reasons he was voted out, but also, in his words, felt ostracised from the entire group leading up to it, which is just awful, genuinely unpleasant to watch. 1 reason was being a doctor. 2 was his toast he gave on the second day when the faithful Ellen was murdered. He raised the toast to remember her and everybody thought it looked really suspicious, which I mentioned briefly in my last video, and I got a great comment suggesting I was being biased here. I argued in that video that Linda breaking down and pretending to cry when Liv had been murdered was obvious evidence that she's a traitor, however that Kasim giving his toast wasn't. And a comment suggested that was me being biased simply because I knew Linda was a traitor, which is a fair argument, but I think there are big differences. I think this is important for me to explain rather than just for defending myself, but it's the question I was trying to stress before. Everybody in this game is dishonest and does suspicious things. When you're playing this, you shouldn't be questioning if someone else is being dishonest, you should be questioning what logical reasons are there for them to be dishonest in this specific situation. What logical reason would Kasim have to toast somebody he obviously wasn't that close to? Well, it could be because he's a traitor trying to look more faithful. We can't rule that out. However, is it that logical for a traitor to put that much of a spotlight on himself in the second episode when nobody's paying too much heed to him then anyway? Maybe, but another possibility is that he's just being nice, courteous. It is unpleasant the way people are just suddenly murdered, and here's someone they didn't really get to know, he didn't really get to know, so he thinks it's just a polite thing to honour her. He's not pretending he was really close to Ellen, he's just offering an ordinary polite toast. Out of those 2 options, I think that's the more logical one, but at the very least it makes it not certain that he's a traitor. Linda, on the other hand, was in episode 6 when she pretended to cry. It was bad acting with no tears. She'd never expressed much emotion before, and nobody considered her particularly close to Liv. Had she done this in episode 2 when they didn't know that about her previously, it might have been more understandable. However, if they think her tears were fake and they don't think she was close to Liv, then what logical reason is there to pretend to cry about someone's murder unless you are a traitor desperately trying to seem more innocent? Adds in the context that there had been a lot of heat on Linda anyway. It's not impossible, but highly unlikely a faithful would do this. So I maintain that there is a difference. Kasim's behaviour is technically suspicious, but the question should not be, have they done something suspicious? It should be, what logical reason would there be for them to do that? And then the third reason people turned on Kasim, the reason that annoys me the most, is because he's too nice. The typical human cynicism. I once made this point about Mr. Rogers, because he seems so very nice, how there can be a tendency for people to believe he must be hiding some dark secrets. He can't possibly be that nice. I don't trust it. There is an obvious element of projection. I only feel positivity towards this person because they are so nice, but I want to project my negative feelings somewhere. How perfectly good this person is starts to feel annoying, starts to feel like a barrier to that. You start to want to tear them down. Ned Flanders in The Simpsons is really nice, therefore Homer dislikes him. This is also the same point about removing differences in a group, really, because if there is someone so very nice, whilst that's great, sometimes that can highlight our own insecurities. You know, we know our own inner thoughts, our own very flawed and negative feelings. So when there's someone who externally appears to have none of that and seems so much better than us, that's difference. That creates tension in the group. Perhaps feelings of superiority or insecurity, whether those are imagined or not. You might then not trust them and might want to vote them out. Which, by the way, I really should say this before we get to the big point. All of this has made group dynamics seem like the nastiest thing in the world. No. Keep in mind this is a game where people are deliberately supposed to banish each other and be suspicious, and it's all happening in a highly stressful scenario. That is not the environment most groups exist within. A group's overt task is rarely to figure out which of them to get rid of, and ideally there are many other ways to help manage anxieties. Ways that can be healthy. Hopefully the environment itself is just less stressful, less pressure. And also that's technically supposed to be a big part of a leader's job, managing and helping support the feelings of their team so that they can function at their best. If only the right people were appointed to be managers in real life. But keep all of that in mind. The Traitors is much more an exploration of group dynamics at their worst, rather than at their best or their most ordinary. And sometimes that does make it very unpleasant, with moments of television I don't like, but it also makes it fascinating to see the kind of broken, ludicrous levels of thinking people fall into. How very ordinary it is for that to happen. But here's the thing. In episode 1 of this season, Jake suspected Linda of being a traitor because she turned her head when Claudia addressed the traitors.
Traitors.
A lot of people were suspicious of Linda as a result, and yet day after day she wasn't voted out. Why wasn't she? She's obviously a traitor. I made a whole video about why not. However, a lot of people argue the big reason is strategy. If you vote out a traitor early on, a new traitor just gets recruited in their place and you're back to square one. If you don't vote them out, you can just keep your eye on them. You know who they are. You can then focus on looking for other traitors, wait till you're nearer the end, then you start voting them out before they have space to recruit anyone new. Plus, one good reason Jake hasn't been murdered in the show is specifically because he had accused Linda. Linda then didn't want to murder Jake precisely because it would have made her look suspicious. All of this is true. Strategically and logically, not voting out Linda until the late game, even until the final, makes the most sense. But as we already know with this show, people aren't always that logical. There's a lot of other, less logical, but very compelling and emotive reasons to vote out the traitors. Here's, I think, 7 of them. 1, you get to find out if you were right. This game is so filled with doubt and uncertainty, plus there's so many other people you thought must be traitors, but when they were banished they turned out to be faithful, so am I right about this person? It seems obvious, but I can't help doubting myself, and it makes me desperate to just find out for good. I want to know if I am actually any good at this game. 2, it makes you look like a faithful if you target and vote out a traitor. In some situations this is a logical thing to do, not always, but regardless of logic, it is an intense pressure you would feel. The burning awareness that nobody quite trusts you in this game. It would gnaw at you. It would create an anxiety in your mind that you would want to relieve. And when this is a game built on forming bonds, you would become very motivated to try and prove your faithfulness. Then people can finally trust me. Then I can finally relax. It's not as simple as that in reality, but that's the feeling. 3, the alternative is voting for people you believe are innocent, and when they're also people you are forming close bonds with, that's very uncomfortable. People often cry and feel very guilty when they vote out other faithfuls, so doing that would likely eat at you. 4, it looks suspicious if you're playing the game too strategically. Dan in episode 6 is a great example for exactly that. None of his behaviour is at all traitorous, but it's not in line with the idea that all the faithfuls are working together in all things. It puts you at odds with the group's herd mentality, and that may cause you to get banished, or even more concretely, if everybody else votes for someone who is a traitor and you don't, and that person then goes and is proved to be a traitor, it looks suspicious that you didn't vote for them. It looks like you're a traitor trying to defend them. 5, finding traitors is literally the task you've been assigned. Logical or not, when that's the thing everybody talks about as what they're supposed to be doing, it would become an increasing pressure. You would want to fulfill the overt task for the simple fact everybody wants to belong. Everybody wants to feel like a valuable member of the team. 6, you can't just decide for yourself who goes. You need to convince the rest of the group to agree with your judgment and vote the same, and that might take time. If you don't give evidence for why someone is a traitor now, who's to say you'll be able to convince anyone later when you need to? 7, similar to point 5, you need to be contributing something. If you're not, you're at risk of being banished in the weeks when nobody has any idea who to vote for, so they just get rid of someone who isn't much good anyway. Harry from season 2 openly admitted this was the motivation for a lot of banishments.
In banishments, there was a couple times where
Right.
the faithfuls were like, we have no clue who it is.
So we're just going to go for the worst faithful who we think, because they're not really bringing anything helping the game wise. So as a team, who do we get rid of?
So, whilst it is arguably more logical not to vote out the traitors at first, it doesn't necessarily mean that remains your primary motivation. There's so much else at work too, and all of that is so interesting, and that's my video. Comment your thoughts. We had some great comments last time. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, maybe even support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Orr, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.